Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Samach Ches. And what we know from the beginning of this chapter of the 10th Parak Nedarim is that as long as a father's daughter is a Ketana, he could be Mefer HaNedarim on the day he hears about the Neder. And after she becomes an Arusa, she leaves his Rishus to some extent, and we'll explain that in a minute. And after she becomes a Nesua, then even though she's still a Nara, she has completely left the domain of her father, and only her husband could be Mefer HaNedarim. In between these two extremes, we have the middle case of Nara Murasa, and the Gemara here on Daf Samach Zayin, yesterday's Daf, spends a lot of time to try to derive the halacha that during her period of Erisin as a Nara, there's going to be a joint hafara right, and you need to have the hafara of both the Av and the Baal. Now the Gemara offers, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, an alternative source in the Torah, in the parsha of Nedarim, that's in Matos, as to how we derive this conclusion that a Nara Murasa, her Nedarim are subject to this partnership, Hafara, that requires both the Hafara of the Av and the Baal. And he says the following. The pasuk, I'll read the first part of the pasuk, doesn't appear on our printed daf. Elach chukim asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, bein ish leishto, bein av lebito, bein ureh beis avir. So on the one hand, the pasuk ends with the words bein ureh beis avir, which means that as long as she's a nara, she's still under the control and in the domain of her father, and he will be made for the dom. But on the other hand, it says Bein ish leishto. So the Bein ish leishto at the beginning of this phrase indicates that the Baal is Mefer Nedarim. Mikan, from this integration of both Bein ish leishto and Bein ureh beis avia, Rabbi Yishmael in his Brisa derives that Nara Murasa viu baila Mefer Nedarim, that we have a joint hafara of HaNedarim. Now, a lot of the questions that the Gemara had raised on Daf Samach Zayin against the derivation of Rabbah will apply here as well, and the same answers that the Gemara gave earlier to defend Rabbah will apply here in Rabbi Shmuel. The Gemara now asks, U'letana debei Rabbi Shmuel, what does this Tana do with the pasuk from which Rabbah on the previous Daf had derived the same exact conclusion that in the case of a Nara Murasa, both her father and her husband will, as a joint shutfis, will be made for Nedarim. The pasuk says in Payo Siel Ish, and Rabbi had already derived from that pasuk that when she has Erusa, which is called Hayo Havaya, then as the pasuk continues, her husband will be made for Nedarim. But it was Vav Moshe Alin Rishon, and therefore it is adding to the father's rights as long as she's a Nara to be made for Nedarim. So my obviously, what does Rabbi Shmuel do with that pasuk? He doesn't need it to derive the conclusion of Nara Murasa that there's a joint effort between the Av and the Baal to be made for Nedarim. So what does he do with that pasuk? So the Gemara answers, Mukim le'idach de Rabbah. The Girsa here should be Rabbah. In other words, Rabbi Shmuel is going to use that pasuk for a different derivation of Rabbah, a different drush of Rabbah from the same exact pasuk. And this is based on a Gemara later on at Daf Ayin in the sugya of what's called Nisrokno Rishus Habal Rishus Ha'av. That means if the Baal dies, then the Av will be made for Nedarim by slipping into the shoes of the Baal, and he'll do so as a single effort, as a as a Robinson Crusoe. Alone, he could be made for the Nedarim, the Baal has died, and we apply the principle of Nisrokna. Now, what happens when the Av dies? So that's going to be a sugya later on, which we'll get to today. But for the time being, as far as the context of the Josh of Rabbah, we're dealing with the case where the Baal dies. Now, when I use the word Baal, and I might use it over and over again, that's not a precise terminology. Instead of the word Baal, which implies after the Suin, we should use the word Orus, after Eris. In any event, after the Orus dies, as we said before, Nisrokna Rishus Li'av, which means that the father can now, as a sole effort, be made for an Nedarim alone. And Rava says that the source for this is from what it says in the parasha of Nara Barosa, Ve'im hayo tiyeh ish. Now, hayo tiyeh is a double language, and it indicates a double havaya. What does that mean, a double havaya? One is the first Erusin, then she either got divorced or widowed, and she had a second Erusin with another person. And the two Havayos now have a hekesh, one to the other. And we're going to compare the Havaya of the first Erusin to the Havaya after the first Erusin, before the second Erusin. So this is called Hikish HaKosuv Es HaNedarim HaKodmim Lavaya Shnia L'Nedarim HaKodmim Lavaya Rishona. So again, there are two Havayas. There's Havaya Rishona, Havaya Shnia. The Havaya Rishona are the Nedarim that she took before she got married, when she was a Pnuya. And vis-a-vis those Nedarim, clearly, as she's a Nara, the father has sole rights of Hafara. Now there's Havaya Shnia, which means that she has Nedarim that she took after the death of Havaya Rishon of the first Orus, before she had Eris into the second Orus. And the Hekesh is going to teach me that just like the Nedarim that she took before the first Erisin, and the father has rights to be made for those Nedarim, so too the Nedarim that she took after the termination of the first Erisin, but before she entered into the second Erisin, which is called Havaya Shnia, those Nedarim that she took after the Orus of the first marriage died, but before she had a second marriage with the second Orus, those two are in the domain, and the authority is the Av's authority to be made for 100 Nedarim. So that's Idoch the Rabbah, and that's what Rabbi Shmuel is going to do with the pasuk of Hayot Tiyeh Ish, which is the double Havaya. Now, the big chiddush of this double Havaya is that you would have thought that once the Av lost his sole control over Nedarim with Erisin on the first round, which means Kodem Havaya Rishona, so she took Nedarim before the Erisin. After that first Erisin, the father is to some extent pushed over to the side. He doesn't have sole rights over Nedarim. So you would think that once he's forfeited those zchuyot, those rights to be made for Nedarim as a sole effort, then even after the death of the Orus, if she takes Nedarim before she gets married a second time, the father is already, so to speak, to some extent out of the picture. But Kamash Malan, this hekesh of the two Havayos that we derive from the pasuk Kisiyah Ish, is going to teach me, if Hayot Tiyeh Ish is going to teach me that no, the father regains his sole rights over Nedarim with the death of the Orus. Now the Gemara asks the flip side. The Rava, which again the gears should be Rava, Hi the Tani the Bei Rabbi Shmuel my other way. Since Rava derived from Kisiyena Le'ish, in Hayot Tiyeh Le'ish, the idea that in Arurasa there's a joint partnership between the Orus and the Av to be made from the Nedarim. What is he going to do with the pasuk of bein ish leishto, bein av lebito, which was the pasuk from which Rabbi Shmuel derived the same conclusion. And the Gemara answers, Boile, he needs it lomar shabal meifir nedarim shebeino leveino. There are two categories of nedarim that are within the jurisdiction of the Baal to be meifir. One is pretty explicit in the pasuk. The Torah says in Parshas Matos called Neder v'chol shvuas isur lanos nefesh isha with the mapikei isha yikivenu v'isha with the mapikei yiferenu. So that's referring to a category which is called inui nefesh. And the classic example of inui nefesh is when she took a neder to abstain from eating or for drinking. That's called affliction to the body. And that's within the jurisdiction of the husband to say, as if to say, I don't want to live with a woman who's in a state of inui. But now the Torah wants to add another category of nedarim, which are likewise within the purview and the domain of the Baal to be meifir. And those are nedarim beino leveino, which means that if she took a neder not to have tashmish or not to have hanoas tashmish, then the Baal could be meifir hanedarim, even though such a neder is not called inui nefesh. Now, exactly why this is not called inui nefesh, I'm not sure. I guess because you could survive without it. You can't survive without achil and shasiyah, so it's not a deep, profound affliction to the body. And now we have the pasuk bein ish leishto, in order to teach me that these nedarim are bein ish leishto, even though they're not inui nefesh, but they're bein ish leishto, beino leveino, like tashmish. And here too, the Baal is granted the schus and the authority to be made for such nedarim. Now, there's no discussion here about the father. What is the scope of the father's ability to exercise his chus to be made for hanedarim? The pasuk says, "Bein ish leishto, bein av lebito," and many Rishonim, the Rosh, Tosfos, the Ran, and the Rashba, they all determine that there's a hekesh in the pasuk between ish leishto and av lebito. And the hekesh tells me that av is like the Baal, that just like a Baal is limited and restricted in his rights to be made for nedarim to those two categories of inui nefesh or beino leveino, so too that applies to the av. But we want to make a point here of a dissenting view of the Rambam. The Rambam in the 12th parak of Hilchos Nedarim writes that the father could be made for all nedarim. And the Meiri here in our sugya formulates this shita explicitly. He writes that the Pnuya, a woman who hasn't gotten married, meifir av af nedarim she'ein bahem inui nefesh, but barusa. Now here's where the Meiri comes up with a little bit of a twist, and he says that once she's an arusa, now the av can only be meifir with the shutfus of the arus, and therefore he becomes restricted in the same way that the Orus is restricted to those two categories of Nidar. So in a certain sense, the Meiri is like a compromise sheet between all the Rishonim on one end and the Rambam on the other. Okay, now we're about to embark upon, shall I say, a challenging sugya. That would be like an understatement. Now, this sugya that we're about to embark upon has two parts to it, but they're both like interconnected. We're talking about the fact that we need the shutfus, in the case of Naram Rosa, of the Afaras Ha'av and the Afaras Ha'Baal. However, what we're not sure about is does it work as an all or nothing proposition? And until we get both hafaros, nothing is registered, nothing has happened. Or shall we say that each hafara unto itself might accomplish something? And for some unknown reason, and if you heard of the Karen Ora, he spends a lot of time trying to figure out the answer to this question. The Gemara assumes that each hafara alone achieves something. There's going to be, the Gemara is going to vacillate two possibilities, what exactly that single hafara will achieve. But the Karen Ora asks, why don't we assume that neither hafara alone will achieve anything? It's just a zero. Why does Gemara assume it's like the two hafaras of the Av and the Baal in the case of Nedarim are A plus B, and A could operate on its own, B could operate on its own in a partial way? Asks the Karen Ora, why not assume that if it's A without B or B without A, then it's nothing, it doesn't even register? And the strange thing that the Karen Ora comes up with is a sugya in Masechet Zvachim. And that sugya is on Daf Kuf Yud, tucked away at the very end of Masechet Zvachim. And it has to do with Menachos, actually, even though it's in Zvachim, with regard to the two parts of a Korban Mincha. The two main avodos of a Korban Mincha are Kmitza and Aktaras HaLevona. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth. What happens if you have one without the other? You only had Kmitza without Levona, or the other way around. And the Gemara has a suffix, whether it's Miklish Bishirayim or Megis. Megis means it's Matir Mechza. And Tosfos points out over there in Masechet Zvachim that Ki Haigavna B'Nedarim the Terik Nedarim Rasa Baal Megis Gayis or Iklish Meklushe. And Tosfos himself makes the analogy between these two sunnahs. Okay, the bottom line of it all is that we really don't know why the Gemara assumes that each hafara alone could accomplish something. And it's a premise that underlies this entire sunnah. Iboiluhu. Baal Megis Gayis o Miklish Kolish. Let's just read a little bit further in the Gemara, because the Gemara now gives an nafkamina, and with that nafkamina, we'll get a little bit more of an insight into the suffix of the Gemara. There are two olives on the table. She takes a neder to enjoin herself from eating the olives. V'shama orus v'heferla. In this particular scenario, it was the orus who heard about the neder, and he exercised his rights to be made for Nedarim, but the father did not contribute his hafara. V'achaltin, and she ate both of these zaysim. Okay, so let's just try to analyze the Gemara. There's one side to say Megis Gayis. Megis Gayis means that, let's say there was a hafara on the part of the Baal, he splits the neder in two, and his hafara is chal on half the neder. So in the case of two zaysim, his hafara is chal vis-a-vis one of these two zaysim. The problem is we don't know which of the two zaysim. But one of the two zaysim is certainly mufar, meaning it's excluded from the neder. But we're left with the neder on the other zayis. And the minimum shear of macholos asuros to generate malchus is always one zayis. So if, let's say, she eats both zaysim, which means that by definition she violated the shvuah, the neder. Why? Because the Baal was only made for one zayis. We don't know which one, but she ate both zaysim. So by definition, she ate the zayis that was not subject to the hafara of the Av. And vis-a-vis that one zayis, there's a full-fledged neder B'melo tokfo, it's 100% of a neder on that one zayis. So she ate both zaysim, which means by definition she ate that zayis, which was not subject to hafara. She gets malchus for violating her neder. Oh, miklish kolish. No. We're not going to divide the neder into two. We look at the neder as one entity, and the power of the Baal to be made for the Nedarim, this neder, without the father, is to weaken the Avera Salah. Now we're going to have to figure out what that haklosha means, to be maklish the neder. But what it means is that if she eats both zaysim, she will not get malchus, because the lav of Bal Yachal Dvoro and the Isur Neder here in this case has been weakened. It has been diminished. It's no longer a full-fledged lav and a full-fledged Isur, and then afkaminis, it doesn't generate malchus. And that's what the Gemara says here. Iyamri Megiz guy is Lakya. If we're going to hold Megiz guy is, so then on the other half, the other Zayis, the Hafaras Habal did not achieve anything, zero. So the Isur on the other Zayis is a full-fledged Isur Neder. She ate both Zaysim, and therefore she'll get malchus for that Zayis. We don't know which one, but that Zayis, which did not was not subject to Hafar. But Iyamri Miklish Kolish, then even if she eats both Zaysim, Isur Bi'almahu, it's only an Isur Bilvad, but it's not a full-fledged violation. It's a weakened Isur, diminished Isur, that's called Haklosha, and she doesn't get mal. This is the stuff. So let's make a few points over here. Point number one is that in the case of Megiz Gayis, where she gets malchus, we're going to have to require a hasra. There's no malchus without hasra. And when are we going to give her the hasra? If we give her hasra before she eats the first zayis, that's a suffix hasra. If we give her hasra before she eats the second zayis, that too is a suffix hasra. And for sure, if she eats one zayis, as we said before, she doesn't get malchus, because that's going to be a suffix. But not only that, even if she eats both zaysim, then it's hasra suffix on each zayis. So we're going to have to assume that the Gemara is talking about a case where she eats both of them b'vasachas. She pops them both into her mouth simultaneously, and that's when she got the hasra. And therefore it's hasra zvada, because we know for sure that if you eat both zaysim, she will certainly violate the neder if you hold Megiz guy. That's point number one. Now, point number two. If we go back to the language of the Gemara, Iboilu Baal, etc., Megiz guys Mikukosha, the Av's name is not mentioned. So the Ran and Tosus and the Rush and the Rashba, the Meir, they all say that Hu Adin Bafar Sa'ah, the Gemara's suffix of Megiz guys and Miklish Kolish, will apply in the case where the father was the only one who, in the meantime, was made for his part of the neder. However, the Shita Mekubetzes on Daf Samach Pes later on quotes the Ra'im, and the Ra'im says that the Gemara's suffix is limited to the Baal. But in the case of the Av, Shita, the Gemara had no suffix, that it was Megiz Gayis. So if I understand this correctly, what we're saying is that the more profound or fundamental power or control over her Nedarim to be made for is in the hands of the Av. When she has Erisin, we're adding the Baal on as a secondary. And of course, we need the Baal as well as a Shukah, but the Av has one up it on the Baal, because the Baal is now sort of invading into the territory of the Av. That's what I understand. So therefore, Megas Gaius is indicative of a much more powerful and profound hafara, where half the net is completely dissolved. However, the Karen Ora comes to the following conclusion: that the reason why the Gemara only has a suffix in the Baal is because in the case of the Av, his hafara doesn't achieve anything whatsoever. It's not Megas Gaius and it's not Mikush Kolish. And he's medayik that from the Rambam as well. So it sounds like, according to the Karen Ora, once she has Erisin and she's begun the process of leaving the Rishus of the father and entering the Rishus of the Oris, and it's going to culminate with Nisuin, the Baal is the one who has the primary control over her Nedarim. Toshma, the Gemara says that we can come to some conclusion about whether Megas Gaius or Mikush Kolish based on a Mishnah later on in Daf Ayin. And this is the Mishnah of what's called Nisrokno. So this is what I said before. There are two sides to the sugya. Now we're entering into the second side, and there's a certain overlap, because from this second side of the coin, called Nisrokna, we're going to somehow come to conclusions about Megas Gaius or Mikush Kolish. So what is Nisrokna? Nisrokna means the following. Perhaps a synonym for the word Nisrokna in halachic terms would be Yerusha. As we said before, the Baal and the Av have joint rights to hafara. Let's look at it as if it's a legal right, a schus mama, and one of them dies. Does the other one now pick up that schus mamon in a certain kind of inheritance, which is called nisrokna? It's like a Yerusha. So, for example, let's say the father dies. The Gemara is going to conclude, based on the Mishnah Daf Ayin, that that's a clear-cut case called lo nisrokna. The Baal does not pick up the father's rights when the father dies to be made for the Nedarim. And this neder now has no hafara whatsoever. It doesn't lend itself to hafara if the father dies. Why? Because the Oris was never granted by the Torah singular sole rights to be made for his Nedarim, and he cannot inherit the rights of the father. However, let's turn it around, flip it in the other way. And it was the husband who died. Here we have a principle called, and we'll learn now all its details, nisrokna. Nisrokna means that schus of hafara that was granted by the Torah to the husband will now, with the husband's death, pass on to the father. And the father is now going to be mefer not only his own chelek, but with the death of the oris, he'll be mefer even the chelek of the oris. And now we're going to learn the various details as to when this applies. Emasai Amru Meis Habal Nisrokna. The reshus of the Baal for hafara was nisrokna, was so to speak thrown or thrust or bequeathed into the reshus, into the court of the father. Number one, Bisman Shelo Shama Baal Kodem Shiyomus. The Baal didn't hear anything about the neder and he died. So he never really picked up any sort of schus. And therefore, the father has the rights to be mefer as if he were the Baal, because the Baal himself never picked up those rights. Oh, sheshama, vishasa. The Baal heard about the neder, and therefore his rights to be made for the neder have already come to the fore. But he died on the very same day that he heard about the neder, and he was shosak. He did not say yay or nay. So he never actually got a chance during his lifetime to exercise the rights that he already had at the moment that he heard about the neder. And now with his death, those rights are bequeathed and transferred, that's called the srokna, into the Av's Rishus. So the Av now slips into the shoes of the Baal, and he'll be Mefer as a sole effort on behalf of the Baal as well. Notice he's now like controlling the driver's seat from two perspectives. He's functioning as the Av, which he is, and also as the Baal, because he inherited the rights of the Baal through the death of the Baal. Oh, now we get to the third possible scenario. Sheshoma v'hefir u'meisbo bayom. The Baal not only heard about the neder, but he was made for the neder, and then he died. And so Shoshaninu, these are the three scenarios in which we learned in the Mishnah later on in Daf Ayin that Meis HaBaal Nisrokna Rishus La'av, that the Baal's rights and authority to be made for the neder are now transferred over to the Av. Now let's talk for a moment about that third scenario where the Baal was made for the neder during his lifetime. The Ran points out that hafaras habal betela b'misoso. This is a brand new principle here. When the husband dies after having been made for the neder, his hafara is gone. And Reb Naftali Trop, who lived about a century ago, maybe even a little less, he interprets it thusly, that hafara of one of the two of these partners is only meaningful if it could link up with the other partner. There's got to be a tziruf between the hafaras ha'av and the hafaras ha'bal, and vice versa. Once the Baal dies and the father during the lifetime of the Baal was not made for, there's no possibility of tziruf, and therefore the Ran insists that the hafara of the Baal dies together with the death of the Baal. And the nafkamina is, says the Ran, that in this case, the Av will have to be mefer basically twice. So he'll have to do one hafara on his own as an Av, and then a second hafara sort of standing in the shoes and replacing the Baal. And why is that? Because hafaras habal betela b'misoso. And the Rashba formulates the principle, which I think is really this is the forerunner of the Rav Naftali Trop that we mentioned. Shetzarch she'aferu shneim b'shah ruya l'shneim lahafer. Right, you need a hafara at a time where they both could be made. So that's why the hafara of the Baal could never actually link up with the hafara of the Av, because the Baal died, and therefore we need another hafara to replace the hafara of the Baal. And that's where we apply the principle of Nisrokna, and the Baal, and the Av, steps into the shoes of the Baal. Now, if we're mentioning the Ran and the Rashba on the sugya, there's a pella here in the following sense. Our sugya seems to be discussing konomos. Now, you may recall that earlier in the Masechet Nedarim, on Daf Lamed Hey, we had a shita, and I think that's how we paskin, yesh me'ila bekonomos. Now, let's try to understand. Konomos is sort of an overlap of both an Isur Neder and an Isur Me'ila. And Rav Papa in Masechet Shavuos Daf Chaf Beis is of the opinion that as far as Konomos is concerned, you get Malchus even for a Kol Shehu. Because since there's an Isur Me'ilah, because Yesh Me'ilah B'Konomos, therefore Me'ilah generates an Isur in Kol Shehu. There's no real shear of Kazayas. So the question now is, why did Gemara insist that if you hold Megas Gaias and she ate both olives, then and only then does she get Malchus? Lamaisa, she doesn't have to eat a full Zayas. In fact, even if there was only one Zayas that she took a neder on, a Konam, there would be an Isur B'Kol Shehu. So why does the Gemara introduce Shnei Zaysim? How do we reconcile the Shnei Zaysim requirement with Rav Papa and Masechet Shavuos that Konamos are Asur B'Mashim? So there's a pella here of a Chidush in the Rashba, quoted by the Ran, that L'divrei Hakol ain't chiyuv karba me'ilah b'misha over al nidro ela b'kizayis. This is what I call a brisket tzvei. That as far as me'ilah is concerned, me'ilah generates a chiyuv carbon. And the suffix of the Gemara applies even to the chiyuv carbon of me'ilah in konomos. So if you hold yesh me'ilah b'konomos, then by violating the neder, the konam, that person is going to engender a chiyuv carbon as a carbon me'ilah because yesh me'ilah b'konomos. But that chiyuv carbon is dependent upon a kezayis, even according to Rav Papa. So Rav Papa is willing to give a malchus for konomos b'mashu less than a kezayis, but he agrees and concedes that the chiyuv carbon me'ilah depends upon a kezayis. I have no clue why this is so, because if you'd ask me, I would say the carbon me'ilah should be engendered by a shava pruta. I mean, me'ilah means you steal from hegdish. I don't know why it's got to be a kezayis. Das verstehe ich nicht. Hashem yoyerei neni. But anyway, the Ran and the Rashba trying to reconcile our sugya Rav Papa, and therefore assume that our sugya wants to work out even according to Rav Papa. Therefore, the Gemara insisted that she had to have eaten one out of the two zayis, meaning the one that's also bekonam, because otherwise she would not engender a chiyuv carbon me'ilah. Okay. And now we move on to Daf Samaches Amid Beis.